Dunning Africa Centre. It's not a place, it's a continent-wide conversation. We shift our focus to the central theme of this month's webinar. Our distinguished panelists and hosts are drawn from across Africa and work in business, academia, and government. Join us every month as we cover the pressing questions facing African businesses today.
Welcome, everyone, to yet another Dunning Africa Centre webinar. It's October, the weather is changing everywhere in the world, and not to mention the political climate. Very excited to be back after a couple of months of summer or winter, depending upon which hemisphere you are located in. And anyway, from my point of view, it's going from summer to autumn, and it feels like winter in Europe. But there you go, that's life. So, and we are back at the Dunning Africa Centre, and we are talking about the big issues on there are many elephants in the room. We have decided to pick this particular one, the elephant being the US elections, and everyone is talking about this, apart from that, the stuff going on in the Middle East, which we won't go into in any detail, but Ukraine, Russia, this is the other big news, the scheduled news, as it were, what's going to happen with the US elections. And of course, the implications of this are profound, and the election in general are of course, always a profound matter because the United States is so important in many, many ways, strategically, politically, as a market, as a buyer, as a competitor, in so many different ways to everybody. In fact, last week I was at Windsor Castle with a bunch of UK government types talking about the implications of US elections for investment into the UK. So this is a question that really kind of makes everyone ponder which way will things go, and particularly so because we are faced with kind of two different worldviews. We have the Republicans with the Trump view, and we have the Democrats who have shall we say, more a different perspective on the world economy and how to go forward, the use of carrots versus the use of sticks, and so on. So these are really the kind of things that concern those that are sitting in Europe, but now we are turning to Africa, which people tend not to pay that much attention. So that's the theme of our conversation. What does it mean for Africa? What will the outcome mean in a few years, in a few months' time, immediately, in the longer term? And for this, I've searched the world literally for the right people to speak, and a number of these right people refuse to speak to us on camera. So, but having said that, I still have found a couple of very wise people who are not afraid of standing up to evidence and speaking for themselves. We have Charlie Stevens, Dr. Charlie Stevens from Rutgers University. I'm an alumnus of Rutgers University, so there is a particular special connection. But Charlie is a distinguished academic and has a particular interest in the continent. And on the other side, we have Zeal, and Zeal is off camera. There he is. Sorry, my eyes are going with age. There he is, and Zeal is with us, and Zeal has been with us before, so he's a man of the hour. He flew in from Lagos, and he's in London. Interestingly, sitting less than a kilometer away from me, and he's a man of many parts as well, based out of Lagos, advises all kinds of groups and organizations. In fact, I'm going to let them tell you about themselves, because you can never do justice to people. Let them be, if they want to be modest, let them be modest on camera. Let me just turn over to Zeal. Introduce yourself, please. This is the right way to do it.
Okay, my name is Zeal Akaraiwe. I run a financial advisory consulting company where we focus on risk management using derivatives. Anybody listening would notice I'm the gap filler because getting anyone to speak about this on camera, I think people don't want to get their foot in their mouth. So I'm the one who said, no problem. I don't have a foot. I don't have a mouth. We're happy to do this. So I run a financial advisory firm. I focus on financial markets and risk management, particularly on derivatives. That's it.
Okay, well, he has distinguished clients. I won't list them all, but watch this space. A man who's as intelligent and handsome as him is, bound to draw the cameras, and you'll see him on the cover of newspapers soon. Charlie, tell us about yourself.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. Yeah, it wasn't until we got started that I thought about, yeah, this is going to be recorded, sent out to the world. In the U.S., at least, they say that the two things not to talk about are religion and politics, and we're going to talk about politics today, at least. But
Religion.
it's a pleasure to be here. Not religion, probably, but who knows? But anyway, my name is Charlie Stevens. I'm at Rutgers University, an associate professor and department vice chair in the Management and Global Business department here. I do research on foreign multinationals' investment into Africa with a focus on East Africa in particular, understanding how firms navigate business government relations, navigate different institutional and stakeholder relations and challenges that they face. I'm also, again, based here in the United States. I am an American, so it'll be interesting to talk about the implications for the rest of the world, Africa in particular, for the U.S. election. So again, pleasure to be here.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Charlie. Zeal and Charlie, I think these are definitely people that one should learn from. There's much to be learned from them. They're modest, but they're also wise. Now, one of the things I want to, of course, emphasize right in the beginning here is that of course, we are talking about African business, which is in a way, it's such a large group that it's almost an oxymoron. But at the same time, there are some ways to generalize. What does it mean? I know there are so many countries we're talking about, and even within countries there are regions, and we could say perhaps that that we are dealing with West Africa and East Africa, but that's not true. We are actually there are issues. I mean, there are two levels of issues. One is at the country level. How do individual countries face towards America? But the second thing is how do people talk about Latin America, people talk about Asia, people talk about Europe, but Africa tends to get forgotten. And to some extent, this is a problem of being on the periphery. In many ways, most of Africa is on the periphery of the periphery, to coin a phrase. And that's a situation whereby one is more, and I'm posing this as a question, one is more on the receiving end, one is more passive in facing things. There are less moves to be played from our side, so to speak, as there might be if you were based in China or you were a firm based in Brazil. And that's my hypothesis. And maybe that's a comment, something, Charlie, you want to say something about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I agree. I think it'll be interesting as we talk today. I think, certainly from the U.S. perspective, issues relating to Africa are not the hot button issues that say Trump and Harris are debating about. But I think there are a number of things that we can talk about, obviously relating to trade and economics, immigration, geopolitics, climate change, you name it, where what the U.S. does, I think, will have a direct impact in some ways and sometimes indirect impacts that I think will be useful for us to kind of unpack today.
Yeah. So, Zeal, I mean, are we wasting everyone's time by talking about this topic? I mean, let me be blunt. This is like the mouse speaking to the elephant. Is that the situation? That here we are going on and on and on. All they can hear is squeaking sounds from their feet.
Well, there's that school of thought. I cannot dispute that is for some people, that is a possibility. From another perspective, talking about the future is also for some people a waste of time. We're not there yet. But I think there are some important things to talk about this regarding preparedness so that we're not taken by surprise. And it's about planning. You play your scenarios, you look at all the scenarios that could play out, you look at the I mean, I don't think there's a significant amount of Africans that will be voting at the election. So there's nothing we can do about that. But in terms of planning, countries plan on certain things that are dependent on relationships with that country. And so if there's going to be a shift or a change, you do not want to be taken by surprise.
Yes.
The elections are in November. Most countries do their budgeting. Most countries should have concluded or at least gone into very advanced stages of their budgeting by November.
Yeah.
So it makes sense to have alternatives to whatever is in your budget that is dependent on the election, so that if and when what happens, if it does not go the way you planned, you have a fallback and you have a plan B.
Yeah, so I think maybe one should point out that we can think about America as an export market for African goods, and that's one of the key points, and perhaps that's where strategically Africa matters more for the U.S. because it is a source of raw materials, which is unfortunately the role that we have picked up over the centuries in different forms. But also, I think that this is so strategically, the importance of Africa from a strategic perspective. Is there any other perspective we can take in this matter, Charlie?
I mean, yeah. I mean, I think that the trade and investment side is in some ways the most important aspect in terms of how the U.S. Could affect the election, could affect the continent. But again, there are probably, I think, some issues again relating to geopolitics, the movement of people. So immigration is a hot topic conversation for the U.S., for example. I do think that there are a few different ways that there are some implications here.
So yeah, so I mean, I'm counting aid. I think there is obviously trade and investment. There's military issues, and of course there is the geopolitics issue, which is I mean, where we stand in the chess game that has always been there, which where people are taking sides. I think maybe that's one of the, in a way, perhaps is a strategic issue which may become more important. We had the Cold War, and then Africa mattered more at that point in time because you had to take, countries took sides. We are facing a little bit of that now. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, and I want to come to this point. The elephants in the room, there's Russia and Ukraine, and there's Russia's engagement in Africa, which has started increasing. And I want us to comment on that briefly. Then the second is China and the Belt and Road Initiative, which has been much talked about and has concerned the U.S. quite a lot. Maybe I think let me assume a certain ignorance on my audience, and let's introduce these three elephants. So there's Israel and the Middle East, which means oil, and oil matters a lot in Africa, in many countries. Angola, Nigeria, everyone's got some finger in the oil pie. And then we've got China and the BRI, and the third thing is we've got Russia and Ukraine. But I think Russia matters more than Ukraine in this story from the African point of view. Let's start off with Russia first. So I think for the audience, Charlie, maybe we can say something briefly about how Russia affects the Africa story.
Yeah, obviously Russia has been playing a large role on the continent, especially in the Sahel. And I don't know if we want to get into how the U.S. election affects the situation at this point, but it's one of those where the U.S., especially before under Trump, currently under the Biden administration, has taken a little bit different stances on Russia. Trump has been a little bit more friendly towards Russia compared to Biden. And so it's one of those where even if there's not a direct U.S. impact, I think in terms of how much Russia's focus is entirely on Ukraine as opposed to other parts of the world, such as the Sahel, especially in Africa, could have some implications for Africa for sure.
And there has been increasing presence of Russian advisors in West Africa. Well, Niger, if I'm Zeal, I mean, physically, we can say this is actually a matter that concerns Nigeria as well, from a security perspective.
Yes, I agree. I'm not a security expert, but I do know that the 3 coups that happened in quick succession in West Africa, there has been a lot of issues about them being anti-West and pro-East. And if you remember, 2 months ago, there was a protest in Nigeria. And for some reason, I'm still not sure about, there were issues of Russian flags being waved during the protest, and I still can't get my head around that. So there is a significant concern around the influence of Russia. There is a significant concern around the fact that Russia and China are more in the same bucket than Russia and America. And those 2 countries are having a significant influence in Africa. So yes, there is some concern around the reaction of America to that and how it will be played out. But in addition to the 3 areas you spoke about, I'm sure we'll talk about it going on. I think areas around counterterrorism, climate change, and a potential pandemic, because the way it will be treated in Africa, especially if you correlate that with aid, it could make a big difference to a lot of things.
These are good points. So I think this, okay, I think maybe we should tackle this one by one. So counterterrorism, Russia, these are issues also connected with other things. But let's start off with America. Let's now turn to and we've got so many things to talk about now. Let's start thinking about 2 perspectives. There is the Republican perspective and the Democratic perspective. Now, maybe I'll turn to Charlie, and first of all, maybe we should give a little bit of a primer how U.S. elections work, and then we can talk about how these 2 different perspectives are different.
Yeah, I was thinking it would be good to give some background and context here. So, I think especially with the U.S. elections, it's typical to focus on the presidential election, but at the same time, there are a lot of positions that are up for voting at this point in November. So you have the president. Obviously, the 2 contenders there are former President Trump of the Republican Party, and then you have Kamala Harris of the Democratic Party, currently the Vice President of the United States. But Congress is up for election as well. So we have the Senate, the upper house, 1/3 of the seats are up for election there. So there are 100 seats total in the Senate, 33, 34 are up for re-election this year. We have the lower house, the House of Representatives, which has 435 seats, and all of them are up for re-election every 2 years, so including this election cycle. And the reason why that matters is that, again, even though we talk about what Trump might do, what Harris might do, and there are some areas where presidents do have unilateral power and authority, especially with some issues relating to foreign affairs, issues relating to tariffs, which I think we'll definitely need to talk about today for sure. In most cases, Congress does need to sign off on what the president wants to do. So right now, when you look at the polling, the presidential race is neck and neck. Kamala Harris has a slight lead, but it's within the margin of error. It's extremely, extremely small. And the way the U.S. elections work is that it's not like we have a national vote where we just count up all the votes, and whoever has the most votes in the popular vote is the president. Each state assigns a certain number of votes essentially to the Electoral College. So the election really hinges on a small number of what are called swing states, states where the margin between Trump and Harris would probably be just a matter of 1,000 votes, a couple thousand votes here or there. So the last couple of elections in the U.S. have hinged on about 50 to 100,000 voters in about a half dozen states that have made the difference in the election. So whether we have a Trump presidency with a Republican Congress, a Trump presidency with a Democratic Congress, a Harris presidency with the Republican Congress, all the different permutations, that could have a huge impact in terms of what kinds of policies we'd see coming out of the U.S. So there's a lot of uncertainty, and everything is right kind of on a knife's edge at this point.
So there could be a situation where you have a kind of what would be an equivalent of a hung parliament, where you have a president from one party and the Congress is from another party, and then that would just everything would get to a stalemate, or things would slow down. So what is the so on average, so the power lies with whom? If the Congress is Republican, the president is Democratic, is that worse than the other way around? Republican president, what do you think?
Yeah, in terms of outcomes. So, like I mentioned, I think tariffs are one of the taxes, tariffs. These have been one of the key economic differences between the two candidates in the U.S. And again, to me, this is potentially the most important in terms of impact on African businesses. And part of that is because tariffs are a bit unique. So most taxes in the U.S. need to be approved by Congress and then signed into law by the president. Tariffs are unique. So tariffs can be, there are a lot of asterisks attached to this, but tariffs can be imposed by a president. So if you had a Republican president but a Democratic Congress, in that scenario, there still could be a number of tariffs that could be put into place by, say, President Trump in that case, as opposed to the reverse scenario where you'd have President Harris would be less likely to impose tariffs on, certainly on African countries. So they're both interested in tariffs. Trump's approach, kind of what he's running on currently, although he says different numbers, but large tariffs on products out of China. I think he's saying around 60%, 60% tariffs on all goods out of China. And then depending on the day, he says 10%, 20% tariffs on products from everywhere else in the world, including Africa, every place. And then you have President Harris, who would keep probably a number of the tariffs on China in place, that some of them were imposed by Trump and then continued under Biden. But I'd have a hard time imagining her putting new tariffs onto certainly Africa, but more allied countries probably not going to see that, which again has implications for AGOA and CFTA. We can talk about that too.
Well, we'll come back to AGOA, because that's really a critical story. But I think, Zeal, do you want to add something to Charlie's commentary there?
Yes, as Charlie was speaking, it occurred to me that there's a point he raised. In one scenario, if the Trump presidency imposed massive tariffs on China, that obviously will affect balance of trade for China. And who knows, maybe it would twist China's arms into setting up more production lines in Africa, and therefore using Africa, assuming the AGOA stays, and using that to push more products into America. So that's a permutation. Again, things like that will not happen in the short run, but it's stuff that would mean that even though negative for China and potentially overall negative for Africa, but the FDI that would flow into Africa in order to counter the negative balance of trade China would encounter based on that, it could be positive for Africa overall. I mean, I don't think that would be the scenario, but that is one of the possible consequences of such an action.
Well, I mean, I'm old enough to remember when we had something called the multi-fiber agreement on the quotas on textiles. And when they put quotas on textiles, I think this was the Clinton administration, correct me if I'm wrong, and put quotas on how much value of textiles would come from various countries. So Taiwan and Korea and China reached their maximum, and then they started setting up factories in sub-Saharan Africa. I remember there was a lot of interest in Ghana as a location. So you could, so the quota of Ghana was being used by Taiwanese companies who were doing some amount of manufacturing and so on and so forth. So as you say, it could in fact be it's an unintended consequence of that happening. So that's quite an interesting. I hadn't thought about that. Now, you know, we are good. One of the let's focus on outward FDI from that is U.S. investment to Africa. Now, how do you see the two sides playing out? I know you said something about protection tariff coming in, but going out, and this is, I think, how will that affect? Will there be a substitution effect in terms of people buying things from? Will there, how will you? There are two sides of the story. One is manufacturing, and the other side is raw materials. So coming to extract, I don't think that will change anything. You will still have the big oil companies looking for petrol, for crude oil in Angola and so forth. That's not going to change, right?
So from my perspective, I think another thing to remember with the tariffs is that there is a lot of discretion for exceptions, and so I think that that's where, I mean, under Harris, yes, but especially I think under Trump, if we do get into situations where there are larger tariffs, I could definitely see where there could be exceptions for issues that relate to national security, to natural resources. And so I think it's a big question mark in terms of whether there's a substitution effect or whether you have some sectors that are excluded from this altogether. The other thing that I'd mentioned too, I mean, Zeal brought up a good point about kind of, say, Chinese FDI, for example. And I think that's what's really interesting about the premise of our conversation today is I think there are just so many, somewhat like ping pong balls, where it's like you throw a ball and it bounces off one wall, it hits another wall, and it's these kind of unexpected or indirect effects that could matter most in terms of say the election outcome for the U.S. on Africa, where I think you could see, say, increased Chinese FDI into Africa. But I think you also have the question of, if the U.S. puts on large tariffs or keeps on large tariffs on China, those goods being produced in China need to go somewhere, especially at a time where the Chinese economy has been slowing down. That just recently they've announced a number of stimulus measures. And so we've seen already a number of tariffs being placed by other countries on Chinese products, electric vehicles, for example. And I think that will be an interesting question. It could be an opportunity, but it could be a challenge too, if the market gets flooded with products coming from China, for example.
So Chinese could start dumping stuff on Africa because they're not going to be as strict about imports, and so we have they will crowd out even the basic manufacturers going on in Africa anyway. So there is that danger of that bounce going wrong, so to speak. So we could have lots of inward investment, but we could also see it knocking out domestic actors.
And I think that's where it goes to what you said about, again, obviously Africa not being a continent, where you could see some countries where these kinds of effects could have quite a positive effect, others where it could be more of a challenge if there's the substitution for domestic production.
I mean, one of the big challenges across Africa is really unemployment, and the job creation. Even though it is not, it should be the top of every politician's agenda across the continent. And in some countries it matters more. It does matter more. In others, sadly, they've completely forgotten about the concept of creating jobs. I'm speaking on Saturday at an event about youth unemployment in Nigeria, and this is a kind of there's no data, but what the summary is, nobody's trying to do anything about jobs, or trying to deal with the fact that we have a large growing population of people. So this is really, in a way, in terms of economic growth, the future is really driven by the fact that we need to have industries that employ people. And that really is what we're not seeing a lot happening. We can't be dependent on exporting natural resources. This is me giving a speech now. But Zeal, what's your take on this?
I will speak to one of the many elephants in the room. I don't disagree with anything you've said, but I think, well, I'm hoping that at some point it becomes a little bit clearer to Africa that certain types of plans have to be made deliberately as opposed to being a consequence. Like Charlie said, there are ping pong balls bouncing, and bats are being held by the Chinese, the Russians, the Americans, and Africa just seems to be the board, just bouncing off.
Yes.
At some point, we need to be able to say, look, because we have these plans and programs and incentives and whatever, we can therefore dictate the direction of the balls. I'm not quite sure it is going to happen in one election cycle in any country, but it's one of the things that's concerned me a lot, that we just kind of wait for the consequence to hit us. And if we're lucky, it hits us positively. If we're not, we get left with the short end of the stick.
But this is what, I mean, to be fair, this is what has always been like across Africa. There's a lot of talk about unity and one Africa and drawing together, but in the end, everyone plays for themselves, sadly, which is why I have my doubts about the African Continental Free Trade Area, or the idea that people will speak with one voice. But let me not go there. I'm sure that people here will now disagree with me on that. But there is that passive nature of policy making, that is to say, let us see what the Americans do to us, as opposed to how we can shape our absorptive capacity to respond to and create opportunities where none existed. So I think that again, I think if I see from the chat, people want to know which one is better. So outward FDI, what do you think? Let's talk about FDI from foreign investment from the United States. Let's forget about China. The story is here. Biden or Harris? What will be the reaction of Biden or Harris towards trade and investment with Africa? Putting aside AGOA for now. Let's start with Charlie.
That's a good question. In terms of outward FDI, I'm honestly trying to, I don't know that I would say that either Trump or Harris would be better in terms of FDI coming from the US into Africa. I think trade could be the more important side to it.
Okay.
I'm just trying to think through. One thing that I think, and again, I hate to keep tying things back to AGOA, but I was thinking about a conversation. I was fortunate to speak with the U.S. Trade Representative, Catherine Tai, had visited Rutgers a few weeks ago, and I asked her about Africa, and the topics that were clearly top of her mind were AGOA, but also the Kenya. I think we're on the 8th round of negotiations and conversations about the Strategic Trade and Investment Partnership, STIP. And that was something I think to some degree is fortunate, in the sense that it was started by Trump, continued under Biden. So I think regardless of whether we have a Trump or a Harris presidency, they would hopefully continue. But I think that's an example of a country, in Kenya in that case, of not being a passive spectator to this, but trying to figure out how to build on trade and investment ties to the U.S. Across a number of sectors. And AGOA was a starting point for that, but a lot of the non-AGOA trade out of Kenya has really increased over the last few years, and I think they're trying to build off of that. And again, I don't see that having much of an impact, regardless of who the president is.
I mean, the numbers are quite small. I don't remember exactly the number on outward FDI, US FDI in sub-Saharan Africa, but it's mostly in resource-seeking sectors. It's mostly about extractive industries. There's very little US investment in manufacturing, and there's some in services, but still, that's some in banking, perhaps, but insurance is in the hands of the Europeans and the South Africans. But so I think it's about so I think the most important thing is, I suppose, imports how will the United States adjust itself between Trump and Harris in terms of importing more from Africa. And I think this now we have to begin a go up. We can't keep walking away from it. Zeal, maybe for the audience, perhaps, I don't know whether you want to do this, tell us, to give us a little bit of background on this story. Not everyone is, you and I have some gray hair. There are people in the room who I suspect may not remember the past.
The past on regarding the background on AGOA.
Oh, yeah.
I think Charlie is much better positioned to do that.
I looked up some stats. I've got
Okay, well, all right, let me pass it to Charlie then.
I don't want to steal Zeal's thunder, but
no, I don't have any thunder. It's cold here.
So AGOA stands for the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. It was enacted in 2000 in the United States. And something like about $10 billion in trade happens every year under AGOA, at least for the last few years. It's been about $10 billion. About half of that is petroleum, oil. The other half, a little bit more than half, is other goods that are led by apparel and by agricultural products as well. And so this applies to, again, I looked this up, over about 2,000 products, there's another 5,000 or so that are eligible under what's called the Generalized System of Preferences. Couldn't tell you exactly what that is. But the point is that, this is a pretty large amount of trade, not all of it. I think about half of I think non-raw material trade is from Africa is from AGOA. But I think the other catch that's interesting with AGOA is that this is not a policy that automatically applies to all African countries. So currently there's about 30 or so countries that have been deemed eligible for their goods to be traded under AGOA. There's another 20 or so countries that are deemed ineligible. And this does include a few, fairly large economies like Ethiopia, Somalia, a few in East Africa like Burundi and Uganda are not eligible. And so this is one area too where I think the election could matter, because there are a number of reasons why a country could be deemed ineligible for AGOA. And it's kind of the number of different strings attached, if you will, relating to, again, carrots and sticks, relating to governance, relating to market access for U.S. products into the specific country. And that's where I think, again, talking to Trade Representative Tai, she focused a lot on issues relating to governance, human rights, corruption, whereas I would imagine, and based on how the first Trump administration was, they focused a little bit less on that and more on issues relating to U.S. market access. So Rwanda is eligible for AGOA, but the apparel sector, which is an important sector, is deemed ineligible because the Trump administration decided that Rwanda wasn't giving enough U.S. access to the Rwandan market, and that too much apparel was coming from Rwanda into the U.S. So there's some details with AGOA. It's not just the headline, say, tariffs that matter. And we're talking about this also just because this is something that was enacted in 2000, was reauthorized in 2015, I believe, on an overwhelming basis, which is extremely rare. Nothing happens in a bipartisan manner in Congress, it seems like these days. But AGOA was reauthorized, I think, on a 79-1 vote basis. So it had overwhelming bipartisan support, but it's up for reauthorization again in 2025, so next year. And so, whether I don't want to bet, but I think regardless, I think it's going to pass, but the details in terms of what would make countries eligible or not could differ.
There will be a difference. So okay, that's kind of good news in a way, but also it's also kind of interesting that not all countries in actually realizing an opportunity is there to export to the US with lower tariffs.
Yeah.
There are opportunity to export to non-commodity stuff. And I don't know if it's being utilized to them. To some extent, the fact that they are happy to reauthorize it is indicative that it's not large enough to matter. If you see what I mean, I'm
You
being
know,
cynical.
yeah. But that's the funny thing about the U.S. and the politics are extremely polarized, and it's tough to get the big picture stuff to move through Congress because you have this degree of polarization. But you'd be surprised. There is quite a bit of stuff that does fly under the radar, and for better or for worse. I mean, AGOA is not the topic of debate between Trump and Harris that they're
Yeah.
bashing each other on, and so things like that can
Right.
get through much smoother. So it would be best if it doesn't become. So we should probably stop talking about AGOA because we don't want it to become the topic of debate.
course.
We
Yes,
might not
yes,
pass.
Well,
yes.
also, Charlie, I checked, looked at some numbers as well. Numbers were quite interesting. There are 17 countries in Africa that are not eligible for AGOA. It's
Yeah.
up from 13 or 14. So that's something else that I thought was quite significant. And then when I looked at the trade numbers, I was quite surprised. Didn't have them up to 2023, but the records that were published in 2022 still showed the other elephant in the room, where a good proportion of the stuff imported by the United States were things around precious metal and stone and mineral fuels, cocoa, very few, if any, negligible finished products. So we still have, despite the AGOA, we still have that inverted pyramid issue where a lot of the exports are raw materials and then the imports are finished goods. And so we're still exporting the lower end of the spectrum and importing it more expensive. And so even though the balance of trade in terms of absolute numbers may look positive for Africa, in terms of the actual contribution to growth from the export markets, we're still very, very low, below where we should be.
Yeah, if I may, yeah, it was very interesting talking with the trade representative on that issue because she, was talking about how, AGOA and how trade with Africa was important, not just on economic grounds, but on promoting human rights and you name it. But then not too long after that, she kind of mentioned that, well, but countries need to kind of, forget the phrase she used, but basically they have to earn their access to the U.S. market. And then I followed up about, okay, well, what policies do we have, or capacity building promotion activities are we doing? And it was kind of not much of an answer because you're right, a lot of it is natural resources, agricultural products. You have some manufactured products, but a lot of it's coming out of South Africa, especially in the auto sector. That's the main exception.
So I don't remember the data myself. There was a time I used to have these numbers off the top of my head. But who are the largest trading partners in Africa or the US? Do you happen to know this?
South Africa?
Yeah, South Africa.
South Africa by far. South Africa
by far, yes.
And Nigeria was maybe 4.
Yeah, and I was looking, I have some stats under AGOA specifically, and South Africa is #1. So I had that $10 billion number of everything traded under AGOA. About a third is from South Africa. About a third is actually from Nigeria. And then you have Ghana, Kenya. So it is dominated by a relatively small number of countries and products.
Yeah. So I have for the total for 2021, the top was South Africa was 15 billion, Nigeria 3.5, Ghana 1.7. So that's a massive difference. Yeah.
Yes. So in fact, the usual suspects, so to speak,
Yes.
are dominating the story. And I suspect, I don't know what Zeal, do you know what the Nigeria, is it only oil, or is it, what's coming in that? What
It's
else do
Largely oil, largely mineral products, yes. Mineral fuels, largely.
Lithium is
Yeah.
now back on the
Yeah.
in Columbite, the usual suspects. Yeah. So extractive industries dominate the
Yes.
story.
Yeah.
So yeah, so election-wise, and this is not going to change. So essentially the AGOA most likely will stay intact. The problem, of course, is the exceptions when countries are ineligible. That's because, as you say, they of human rights or governance issues or corruption. These are the reasons for disqualifying people from AGOA. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's one of the main reasons.
And this recent stuff about Kenya, I mean, I think this is worth highlighting, and maybe it's not something everyone knows. So perhaps what I'm talking about is the engagement between the U.S. and Kenya, which was seen in Kenya as something of the Americans kind of taking over sovereignty of Kenya in some way, and it became something of a source of political unrest, if I'm not mistaken. Uh, Maybe we could just say something about that, Charlie.
Yeah, I don't have as much information about the details of what they're negotiating. I wasn't aware of kind of the perspective of
Yeah,
that perspective from Kenya. I just do know that so Kenya is a little bit different compared to we're talking about oil out of Nigeria. A lot of the trade from Kenya, especially at least through AGOA, is in apparel and agricultural products. Actually, more than half of Kenya's exports under AGOA are in those sectors. And so my understanding is that that's those sectors, some other ones as well, are some of
right.
the focuses of this uh, agreement. And I think it's the first. I think it might be the only bilateral agreement between the U.S. and an African
Yes.
nation, which I think that was also part of the motivation from Kenya's side is the hope that this could turn into a broader free trade agreement. Um, I'm
So
not sure.
there is that conversation going on under the Biden administration to have more engagement, to do a kind of BRI American version. And this is how I read the news. Is this the same perspective that Zeal that you have as well? That this was a conversation, the idea of the railway line, the investing in infrastructure, kind of offering an alternative to China. Is that how you see it from your window, so to speak?
My limited view on that, yes, that's I said, very, very limited opinion on that. But yes, it sounded like a statement against China. I'm Nigerian, so we didn't really like it, but but
Yes.
yes, I would say so, yeah.
Yeah. So this kind of again this geopolitics that the U.S. elections is not just, and we know that. So you'd think that, of course, we assume that this attitude, Biden's attitude or Biden administration attitude towards Africa and offering a half-hearted or a somewhat muted version of BRI, American version of BRI, is something that the Harris would continue with, most likely, I think. The odds are that anything like that would, of course, not get the okay from Trump. Or what do you think, Charlie?
Yeah, I think just broadly that's and beyond this specific issue even. I mean, I think that again, just looking at it from the perspective of African businesses and not just how it matters, but why, I think under Harris, you would see a lot of continuation. I think there'd be a lot less uncertainty. I think there'd be a lot of commonalities, with Biden and even, we're not that far removed from the Obama administration. I think there'd be a lot of continuity. And that's where it'd be interesting, just from a policy standpoint, where if Harris wins, where it's like you had 8 years of Obama, then Trump would be kind of this 4-year blip, and then you have Biden and then Harris. Whereas I think there's a lot more uncertainty. I'm thinking about kind of a distribution of outcomes. I think that distribution is much wider under a potential second Trump administration. Again, it would depend on who controls Congress. But I think that there are some areas where there'd be a lot of areas where there'd be large breaks from, say, the Biden approach. But there could be a number of areas that are different even from the first Trump administration, because he is being advised by a different set of people than the first one, which were a little bit more conventional Republican thinking on trade and investment. But this time around, my understanding is that the plan would be for again these larger tariffs, wider tariffs, and just a little bit more embrace of that more protectionist approach to trade and investment.
So, I mean, one of the things that, people are trying to predict what the second Trump administration will do based on what the first Trump administration did. Now, I think that I personally feel this is not really a good strategy, because I don't think they expected to win the first time around, and they didn't actually have any plans. I mean, I remember the chaos in the beginning when, oh, we won. How do we run the place?
Now what?
So everything was a bit ad hoc, but they've had 4 years to sit back and think about, okay, how we should have done it the first time around. So now there's more deliberation about what policies to bring in and so on. So, and that makes it a little bit more kind of dangerous, or could be good, because now they have to think long term. They have to think strategically, and it's not about the president; it's about president's team. Because the president just says, as we know, the president just in a way gets steered by a bunch of people. The question is whether they can steer Trump. That's another story. We don't have any psychologists on our team, but we do know that there are enough people who are not kind of completely nuts amongst the people around him. So maybe that's something, I don't know. I'm hoping that there's a certain amount of more rational behavior, because things are not happening off the cuff. Zeal, I know you want to disagree with me there. Go on.
Yes, quite a bit, because the things, and again, this isn't really about the individual, Trump or Harris, yeah? The things Trump did in his first term were not inconsistent with Trump's behavior outside the presidency. The things he said are fairly consistent over the last decade,
Yeah.
whether within the political sphere or the business sphere or the social sphere.
Yeah.
I think Trump is a fairly consistent person, to be very honest. I'll give an example. So if we talk about trade and economic relations between America and Africa regarding these elections, I think it's clear that Harris will be significantly more aligned with the traditional democratic approach to business and economic relationships. I believe she will support AGOA and any other multilateral initiatives that promote sustainable economic growth for the two countries. But you see, Trump has made it clear, he has always made it clear, America first. And I think whatever policies he's going to come up with regarding trade, he's going to prioritize bilateral trade agreements over multilateral trade agreements like AGOA. And that's not because he does not like anybody. It's just that if he thinks America first, it makes sense to prioritize bilateral. Now, and that's the way I see a Trump president. So for example, let me give another example, right? We know Trump doesn't, from the things he says, he does not really believe in climate change, right? So all the initiatives from the Democratic Party towards other countries, in particular Africa, to promote a protection of the environment and all that, I don't think Trump is going to continue with that. Not because he's good or he's bad, but over time, he has had his doubts on whether climate change is real. So it's not just about what he did the first time. Most of what he did the first time around were very consistent with things he said outside of politics.
That's interesting. I think this has actually been a policy since the Bush administration, if I'm not mistaken, to have to undermine multilateral organizations by having bilateral, and I'm talking about the elder Bush rather than the younger one. I'm maybe my age is showing now, but I remember a huge effort in the 80s to have BITs sign bilateral investment treaties. And then the idea was to weaken the WTO and Geneva-based organizations and pull it away from that the BIT superseded the multilateral agreement. So, and this is not so. Therefore, it's in a way maybe it's been consistently there with the Democrats having showing more respect to the multilateral agreements, but still keeping the BITS model going. Am I wrong, Charlie? You know this better than I do.
Yeah, I mean, not my area of expertise, but my understanding matches what Zeal was saying in terms of, I know Trump, and again, this was in his first term as well, including what he's talking about now, tends to prioritize, and that's a good question about whether that's in general a Republican strategy to prioritize the bilateral trade. I know obviously Trump was very negative towards, say, the WTO. I mean, take your pick: WTO, NATO, United Nations. Yeah, a number of
WHO.
yeah. So because I think that the part of it is that there's a feeling that not wanting to have your hands tied by these other organizations, and rather trying to negotiate terms on your own preferences with bilateral agreements. Whereas I think, like you said, I think from a Democratic standpoint, it is both and, both respecting the multilateral arrangements, but also moving forward some of the bilateral agreements that make sense.
So one of I see, Zeal, your point is a good one, that even though we thought before the first Trump administration that he was just saying things to get votes, but then we were all surprised to see he actually followed through on many of what we thought were crazy things. But actually, to be honest, what shocked me even more was when Biden took over, I thought he would start repealing everything that Trump did, but he didn't. He actually kept on board a lot of this China stuff, a lot of the tariffs, a lot of the steel thing. I expected a lot more loosening to happen, and we would go back to the Obama level. But he did not go back to Obama. Biden just didn't go back. He just continued as it was, which really took us, at least took me, by surprise, thinking that there would be more of an adjustment. So in a way, we're expecting. So Trump is not going to be a huge change from. Maybe that's I'm proposing. Trump isn't going to be a big difference from the Biden administration, because some policies came from Trump to Biden and then have been carried on, and now will be taken over if Trump came back or whoever comes back. So we're having continuity. Is this a reasonable argument to make that actually, despite all the hoo-ha, we are going to have continuity?
It depends on how you define reasonable and continuity. But you have a very good point. And here's what I think. I think that Trump is what you call a systems one thinker, and every other president should be systems 2 and systems 3. System 1 being they are not very conversant or appreciative of consequences of their actions. Yeah. If they see something, they say it, they do it, and they'll deal. We'll cross that bridge when we get that kind of thinking. That's how I see Trump. I see the Democrats more of what if we do this, how do we manage it? And so I don't think it's necessarily that they don't support what Trump did as much as they don't support how he did it and the haste and the lack of planning with which he did it. But having done it and gotten away with it, they're like, well, what the hell? Might as well just sit on it for a while.
So the semblance of democracy is important. Even if you even if you agree with the outcome, you'd rather it was done in a way that made it look like you were being inclusive. Is that what you're saying?
But look, let me use the corporate world that most of us will be very familiar with. You want to do a corporate restructure, you want to downsize your company, you want to fire a lot of people. What do? You go hire a consultant into HR.
To blame
the consultant fires everybody, and then there's a lot of issue, and then you pretend like you don't know what happened. They're like, oh my, is that what the person did? Then you fire the
Yeah.
consultants and then placate everybody else. So it's not an uncommon strategy.
No,
But
I'm not at all. It makes sense. Charlie, what's your take on this?
Yeah. No, it's a good question. You know, as you were talking, I was thinking about, I think it really depends on the issue area. So in terms of, is there a substantive difference? How much, that kind of a thing. And I think especially in the US, a lot of what's being discussed this election cycle are domestic issues, issues of taxation, issues of immigration, issues of, again, social issues, issues relating to, say, abortion and things like that are major topics. And I think that there would be some major policy differences between the two presidencies. I think the foreign side, the foreign relations and trade and investment side is interesting, where I think there could be more continuity in some areas than you'd expect. China, you started with China, and that is one where there's been a bipartisan shift in thinking on China in the US from one of engagement. And that started, from prior to China joining the WTO, from Clinton to the second Bush to Obama, and things really starting to shift a little bit towards the end of Obama's term into Trump, continued through Biden in terms of taking a much more confrontational stance towards China, for example. So I think foreign policy is one where, depending on the issue at hand, there could be some differences, but other ones where, again, they have different stances on, say, Russia, Ukraine, probably a little more slight, but still differences between, say, Israel, in the Middle East. China maybe is just more a matter of degree rather than fundamentally different approaches between the two candidates.
So, okay, so essentially, what the conclusion we're coming to really is that when it comes to trade and investment in Africa, we're not going to see much of a difference on either side of the story. We'll see tweaks going on, but no major shift. Is this what I'm offering I'm being brave since I'm being here anyway. Might as well. In a month, we're completely wrong. Maybe Trump will be elected. He will
Delete the
say,
recording.
I heard about this organization called DAC, and it will be big news for 24 hours when he says, yeah, this Charlie Stevens, I don't know who he is, but and so on.
I think at least
come
for
and
me,
stay with me. I have a couch.
yeah, right. I think for me, at least, for the things that are Africa specific. So again, we've talked a lot about AGOA.
Yeah.
We've talked a lot about Kenya. I don't say, again, this is one of those things I'll regret saying if it turns out differently. I don't think there'll be a major difference between the two candidates. What I really do think about, and what I know businesses in the US are really thinking about, are these issues relating to tariffs and, on the domestic side, taxation. Because that's part of why the tariffs are being even discussed, is that, again, we haven't talked about it, but Trump had initiated a pretty large tax cut, both corporate taxes, income taxes, and that's part of the reason for these tariffs, with the thinking being that this would offset the revenue loss from the tax reductions. Those tax cuts, like AGOA, are also up for, well, they would be set to expire, I believe, next year in 2025, unless they're renewed. So that's where I think would be a big difference between the two, is if these tariffs do get enacted in any sort of way, just the ping pong balls, the ramifications from that could be huge in terms of trade and investment, in terms of inflation, in terms of the deficit. All of these things would have ramifications.
One thing that I've not mentioned, and I realize actually is a big deal, is going to be debt, the debt crisis. There's a forthcoming debt crisis. Zeal, you may know more about this, but before COVID, so during COVID, I looked at the numbers and I realized that everyone had been borrowing money, not just across sub-Saharan Africa, but Latin America, hugely indebted because money was cheap. You could borrow money for almost nothing. And everyone thought, and you could sell commodities and there was money to be made. So just borrow money, do things, because you can get reelected with that. And then suddenly now the money is no longer cheap. And now you built up all of this debt in US dollars, and people are going to start, the chickens are going to come home to roost, in summary. Now, I don't know where it's going to start from, but I get the feeling once Ghana was, first to go down, and I'm thinking, what's going to happen next? Where are we? Are we going to have a debt crisis? And this comes to aid, because what's going to happen is people are going to queue up either to the, various, clubs, Paris Club, etc., and then or to the World Bank or to the US, coming in and saying, aid, fix things. Uh, so I mean, aid is important, uh, but I'm not sure entirely what's going to happen with these dominoes. Am I wrong, first of all? Is there not going to be a domino process whereby sovereign debt starts piling up? Kenya borrowing money, Ghana borrowing money. Where is it going to go? Zeal.
That's interesting. I think, okay, bringing it back to the subject of the elections, I think that there could be, in a Trump presidency, given that his priority is America first, which should be any president's priority, to be honest. I think we could, in Africa, we would see significant cuts as it relates to foreign aid and assistance, whatever type of assistance. I think Trump is going to focus or do his best to focus on making America great again by making the domestic issues his priorities. I think by the numbers I looked at in his previous term, there was some reduction in the U.S. involvement in global aid business in general. So I think that's one area. On the other hand, I'm not sure Harris would toe that line. I think Harris would more likely maintain or increase foreign aid. Now, but to your other point, it's in some of these things, it's not so much what each party or each candidate will end up doing. I think it's also about how they will do it, and that how will cause a reaction in the sentiment towards America as a whole. So, for example, Trump is the type of person who could tell a country, go to hell, I'm not helping you on this matter, sort yourselves out, your leader stole all your money. Trump could say that, right? I don't think Harris would say that. I think Harris would say, let's see what we can do and draw up an agreement and negotiate with you for 4 years and give you terms you can never meet. But it's in those 4 years, you're happy, right? In those 4 years, you're happy and you think, oh, they're trying to help us, but there's possibly no intention in doing it. But Trump is going to tell you in 4 minutes to buzz off. And you see, that is going to change the sentiment, the global sentiment towards America. And it may make people more hostile. And you see, it has its own ripple effect. So I don't think the debate is really what will happen as much as which of the two has more diplomacy to do what ought to be done without stepping on toes unnecessarily.
Okay, that's Charlie, before I say anything, let me pass it over to you.
Yeah. No, and that's again, I think, just to not be sentimental about any of this. I mean, I think all countries, all politicians are trying to figure out how to advance their country's interests. And I think there's obviously different ways of going about that. But, again, neither Biden nor Harris, and we could say that about other countries that have an interest in Africa as well, are going to do things just purely out of their own benevolence. There are always strings attached. And so, but I think, something that Zeal hinted at that I think is interesting to think about is that there could be approaches that may be on one particular issue. And it could be an issue relating to aid, to debt relief. There could be one approach that makes the most sense. But I think that there are some spillover effects where, there might be cooperation needed on, again, issues related to, we've kind of danced around issues related to climate policy and climate change, for example, geopolitics, these different elephants in the room. There's a lot of different types of coordination that are needed even between countries that don't always see eye to eye. And I think that'll be interesting to see how that plays out. I don't have a crystal ball, But these are all big issues, right? These are all complicated issues that go beyond the U.S. or Africa. It'll be interesting to see how and whether kind of
So the
coalitions are.
dominoes will start falling in Latin America first. It's my prediction, because the debt crisis will start there. And I think my feeling is that for America, Latin America matters more than Africa. Has the geopolitics of, again, it comes back to the Monroe Doctrine. It's which still has carries some weight. I mean, again, Charlie, you're on the ground there. Uh,
That's a good question. I mean, I don't know. When we talk about Latin America and focus on Latin America these days in the U.S., it's primarily around issues related to immigration. I don't know if we start to have debt crises in Central and South America. I don't know that they would necessarily be and face a more favorable outcome just because they're in the Western Hemisphere, Monroe Doctrine not accepted. I don't know, but I think they could be prioritized only if there's a concern that they could result in mass migration, which is a large topic in U.S. domestic politics for sure.
Okay, no, I'm not, I'm a bit hesitant to get into the issue of immigration in Africa. And I'm immigration to America. This is not a crash course on Japa, which we can which I can collect 5,000 naira from everyone attending to listen to our predictions, but where to apply for a visa. But let's leave that one alone. So, okay, aid. We talked about aid. We talked about debt crisis forthcoming. I believe future debt crisis coming up. Um, and I think the other one is the military side of the story, which we kind of alluded to at the beginning that with Russia playing some kind of minor role currently, and um, there is that military side of the story, which I'm not sure how important it is between the U.S. and but I think it has to do more with geopolitics than anything else. Am I dismissing it too easily? Zeal.
I can't say I know the answer to that. I can't say I know the answer to that, to be very honest. I do remember it was 2017 when Trump banned certain countries from visiting America, and that created a whole lot of issues. Now, again, it's everything, like I said before, subject to how it's presented. Yeah, the reception can be very different. If you wake up and say, I don't want this group of people, then you're going to create a global issue, as opposed to having a silent policy where you don't do it, but there's no announcement that you're not going to do it. So I think those are the little nuances, and I'm not sure how all of that is going to play out. I'm really not sure.
No, but I'm thinking more in terms of the military reaction to where does Africa matter in the military strategies, the geopolitical strategies of the United States? Is it something that would play out in some way, whether it's Trump or Harris, or does it play out at all? And if it does play out, does it play out differently between Trump and Harris?
Yeah, I think it would play out quite differently because Trump, in his first term, was very concerned about U.S. troops dying abroad for other people's causes and wanted to reduce that to near zero, right? And so that, I think, again, very consistent with his inward look, make America great again. What is good for the domestic is what is the priority, as opposed to Harris that would consider collaboration and counterterrorism and look at the ripple effect that if you let this go out of hand outside the America, at some point it's going to come back into America as a target. So
So
I think there's going to be a significant shift in policy. Now, how that policy will be addressed or put into work, I'm not sure, but I think Trump is going to do much less regarding the geopolitics of other regions. And some of those regions that have been kept, or rather, some of the conflicts that have been kept at bay because of the assumption that they don't want America to get involved. And if there are those kind of conflicts that the political class is involved and they don't want their assets frozen, they don't want the repercussions of the big America. If they see that Trump is uninterested, then those things can very quickly escalate.
So, I mean, I don't know exactly where where American military cooperation is going on in the continent. Do you? I mean,
I don't think it's as much where they are physically as it is. No, security is about belief, it's psychological. I don't think it's as much where they are as it is the belief that they can come here. If there's that notion that they're not going to, it's like sometimes there's some areas in any city that people do not commit crime because they believe if you commit crime in this area, the police will show up in 2 minutes. If that belief changes, it's going to change the crime profile of the area. So that's what I'm talking about. I don't think it's so much about whether the troops are there or not. It's about the policy. If people believe America is not interested anymore, then there could be more bold aggression by terrorists in other areas.
Interesting. That's Charlie.
Yeah, I don't know. I think to me, I think Zeal is exactly right, and I think this applies to some of the, larger tensions that we're seeing right now, again in the Middle East, Russia, Ukraine, you name it, a potential China-Taiwan situation, where I think a lot of actors are trying to weigh, yeah, again, how engaged is the U.S.? What would the U.S. response be to these issues? And so, but I think it's true for either candidate, where I think the U.S. in general doesn't have a whole lot of appetite right now to get involved with large foreign involvement. I mean, it took 20 years to unravel some of the larger commitments to Afghanistan and Iraq, for example. So I do agree. I think the counterterrorism angle it'll be interesting. I don't have any predictions, but I think that would be a large angle. Then I think the other big thing is that we don't know what we don't know. I mean, you think about, I don't think anyone anticipated the, situation with Israel and Hamas breaking out the way it did when it did. Even Russia invading Ukraine felt like it kind of came out of the blue. I mean, who knows what the next black swan event is that could happen. And I don't think anyone knows. Even the candidates themselves potentially don't even know how they would respond to these kinds of issues.
No, yes, but I agree that we don't have a crystal ball, but I think this is exactly why we're doing this webinar, because it's interesting now for us to intelligently speculate about these outcomes. I mean, I did not. Many of the things that have happened on the planet, I've predicted wrongly. So I'm not, and this is not for want of trying or being earnest. So I mean, but I think it's important for us to think about it because in many ways America is seen as a light, as a leading light, as a light of whether rightly or wrongly as a beacon of what did Winston Churchill say? You can rely on the Americans to do the right thing after they exhausted all the other alternatives.
Yes.
And nobody remembers the second part of the sentence. Everyone says they can rely on the Americans to do the right thing. But it's true. There is that assumption that they will do the right thing after they exhausted all the alternatives. And everyone is sitting there, and in regards to the Middle East, and with waiting for but let's not go there. We are sticking to the story of Africa here. So that's the same thing. And we have a comment here in the chat about helping Africa root out the evil aspect of corruption. And we all look to someone else to solve this problem. And so where this carrot and stick. It's for me this is a problem that cannot be addressed by anybody from the outside beyond refusing visas to highly corrupt people or cutting off. These are blunt instruments. Cutting off aid because you have high levels of corruption or cutting off access to AGOA. But beyond that, is there something practically that can be done, Zeal?
Regarding corruption specifically?
Addressing Africa's many ills, or I'm being generic here intentionally.
Okay. I have a very contrary view on this, but anyway, we're speaking about the impossible. So, I genuinely believe that one of the key issues we have is the fact that the customs and the culture, and I'm not talking native culture, I'm talking of the general behavior of a group of people. The culture a lot of African countries use today was imposed and contrary to their innate culture. And so the definition of concepts is contradictory. So I'll give an example using Nigeria. In my native culture and every native culture I know in Nigeria, giving gifts is normal.
Yeah.
You see people, if I go to my village, I'm expected to see the elders with gifts. There are parables about it, there are sayings about it. It's just what we do. But in the Western world, in terms of the English law that we have adopted, we have criminalized giving gifts. In other words, we have criminalized our culture without changing the culture. And so in the legal sense of corruption, our culture is corrupt, and nobody's going to accept that. I'm not saying there is no corruption, but I'm just saying we've left the boundaries so loose that it has become completely impossible to police. Completely.
No.
So when we talk about corruption, I like to say, look, especially in Africa, can we break it down? In my culture, for example, we won't talk about religion. In my culture, you're expected to set up a business, and the first person you employ is your brother or your cousin or someone close to your family. In law, the Anti-Corruption Act in Nigeria, it is criminalized. It is called nepotism, right? So is the minister corrupt for employing his brother? Absolutely. But in the culture, he's expected to do that. So and I think one of the first steps of getting rid of corruption or reducing corruption to a level where it does not impede growth is to redefine these concepts and then put boundaries around what is acceptable. A lot of what we call corruption in Nigeria is acceptable in the West within certain parameters. Good example is the lobbyists. Charlie will speak about them. There are people, all their job is to lobby. What are the lobbyists doing? What are they doing different from what we do in Nigeria or South Africa or Kenya or Uganda or Ghana that we don't scream hell and high water? The difference is they've put boundaries around it. And so everybody knows these are the boundaries. We don't have boundaries.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that given our rather diverse audience, I don't know whether you can generalize about all tribes across Africa and the culture, but no, I do recognize that at what point in time does it go from being I'm showing you respect in terms of my hospitality, and at what point in time does that hospitality, if I invite you to my house and I feed you, which is my obligation, right? If you come to my house, I have to feed you. But if I feed you and I give you, 3 goats to go home with, is that now crossing the line that, okay, these are for your wife, here's, and then if it isn't 3 goats in a Mercedes Benz, is that now going too far? At what point in time are those goats which I'm giving for you to feed your family with when you're going home?
Those are the boundaries I speak of that don't
Yeah.
exist. Yeah.
So this is a big topic. We don't want to end up going into corruption.
No, we don't.
We could take our whole lives to discuss this.
Yeah.
But we're coming close to the end of our very freewheeling conversation about the election. So let's end with, since we are putting our necks on the line here, predictions. Let's start with predictions. Let's start with Zeal. What do you think is going to, what do you think, where do you put your money on for the outcome of this election?
I'm going to bet everything I own,
Huh?
every single thing I own,
Huh.
that Trump or Harris will win the election.
This is when I say I want to fight you now, because that's a coward's way out.
So,
Also,
and nobody
as a
can place the same
businessman.
bet as me. So I'm betting everything, and nobody can place the same bet as me. So you guys go ahead.
That is true. That is true. Okay.
Honestly, I can't say. I honestly can't say. I honestly can't say.
Charlie,
Like Charlie said in the beginning, it's so tight. It
is tight. Charlie, what's your take?
Goodness. Don't know. I really don't know. I mean, the last, I don't know how many, it's been a while since we've had a very predictable election in the U.S. Why not? You know, there's no money on it. I'm going to predict a Harris presidency with a Republican Congress, and we have gridlock for 4 years.
Yeah,
That's
this
my
is,
prediction.
you know, I have to say this is to some extent, this is perhaps what is wishful thinking, because I think a little stability is what we need now, and statesmanship, which is what we're missing. No, as Zeal said, the outcome may be the same, but at least someone pretends to have shown you some respect while making the unpleasant decision. You know, that sort of that may be the best we can hope for. That, you know, the doctor gives you a sweet before giving you the injection, you know, or after giving the injection, doesn't matter. At least there's a positive aspect to the story. So I think this might be the place to. Well, we'll see, and maybe we'll come back in a couple of months. Yeah.
Yeah. Something I want to add. I after Biden dropped out of the election, I started getting a sense that Trump did not want to win the elections. I started getting a sense that Trump wanted to win Biden in the elections. So his campaign changed right after everything changed for Trump right after Biden dropped out. So I don't know if Trump is in it to win or if he's in it to win Biden. So
okay.
To take back what he lost, basically.
Yeah. Just it's a matter of his honor.
Yes. Ego, let's call it what it is.
Ego.
Yeah.
Yes, there's a lot of money to make a point, but okay. Okay, no, that's very interesting note. You know, let's maybe we'll reconsider this in 100 days time or something like this. In January, we get together again and we say how wrong we were, or how congratulate ourselves. And in case Trump does watch this video, one of his assistants, and he decides to tweet about it, you know, I'm very happy. If anyone in the room wants to retweet this, feel free. Happy for him to point out the Dunning Africa Center, where we have, it's not a place, it's a continent-wide conversation. So on this note, let me thank everybody here, the audience. Everyone turned up with rather short notice. Thank you for listening and your feedback. We were able to answer some of the questions. I think that there's no good news, I think, in summary of the thing. Whichever way we look, the future may be somewhat bleak. We need to look after ourselves. This is the end of the story, really, that whichever side goes forward, we are the recipients of their largesse, rather than we are being passive. So perhaps we need to think about how we, deal with stuff ourselves, just as much as worrying about who comes into power. Let's reconvene in a while, either at a conference or let's have another webinar and say, this is what the world looks like again. Inshallah, everything will sort itself out in a positive way. Thank you, audience. See you in a very short time. Zeal and Charlie, stay online. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Dunning Africa Center. It's not a place, it's a continent-wide conversation. Join us on the first Thursday of every month.